All right, prepare a new quad chart for the last lesson in Unit 3, a prolonged war. We're going to wrap up the Vietnam War today. And our essential question is, what political pressures were present in the later stages of the Vietnam War? Interesting quote from Ho Chi Minh himself. You can kill 10 of our men for every one we kill of yours. But even at those odds, you will lose and we will win. Because the guerrilla is always fighting with time. Time is on his side. He doesn't worry about popular opinion. And that's exactly the weapon that he used against us in Vietnam. The credibility gap we talked about in the last lesson continues to widen. Remember, General Westmoreland was saying how we'd won everything in Vietnam and every battle we had won. And this results in him being replaced, actually promoted out of position back to D.C. He's replaced by General Crichton Adams, and General Adams inherits a mess when he gets in there. There's this battle called My Lai. And the My Lai battle happened really with a unit of National Guardsmen who had been up drinking and using drugs all night. They say that the NCOs and the soldiers were drunk, the officers were high, and they went into this area that supposedly had a lot of Viet Cong in it, and they killed them all. Reported back as in the newspaper. It was a great success. The president commented on it. And then months later, it comes out in this article called the Pentagon Papers. A reporter had heard about My Lai and what had actually happened and essentially changed from a battle to a massacre. What these men went into that village and did is they killed essentially about 200 unarmed South Vietnamese people. They called them Viet Cong. There was a particular incident where a soldier was ordered to fire an M79 grenade. It's a grenade launcher, looks like a breech-loading shotgun, fired that into a group of people. You can see here this is primarily women and children, and there were older people there. There were no fighters in the village at all. And again, what was celebrated as a great battle and a victory for the United States turns out to be a black spot on our military history. Lieutenant Calley was the commander. He was sentenced and convicted of killing 109 unarmed, innocent civilians. Ultimately sentenced to house arrest and finally pardoned. Never served a day in jail. But the whole incident was really stopped and reported by some helicopter pilots who saw what was going on, landed the helicopters and pointed guns at these guys and said, "You will not kill anybody else." Just a definite black spot that continues to erode public support for the president and for the military's prosecution of this war. It gets so bad that President Johnson does not seek re-election. Senator Robert Kennedy has announced his candidacy for president, and he's assassinated. What a troubling time in our country, right? This is completely unrelated to the Vietnam War, but Sirhan Sirhan was a Palestinian who disagreed with the American stance on Israel and assassinated President John Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, as he was really popular in making a run for the presidency. This opens up the door for Richard Nixon, and he was campaigning like so many presidents in the past on vowing to end the war. I mean, anytime we're at war, you can name a president who was campaigning or a candidate who was campaigning to promise to bring the troops home. And that's exactly what President Nixon does. He wins in a landslide. Compare this to the map of the election we just saw, right? I mean, we have an overwhelming win for President Nixon. And then, we have these states down here in the bottom, which kind of separated and went with Senator Wallace. His big term that comes out of this is the Vietnamization of Vietnam. And that's the withdrawal of our forces by committing resources and training to get their army and their security forces ready to protect themselves, with a goal of withdrawing, several every year. And I look at this through my own perspective. President Obama used the same term as we were moving out of Iraq, called it the Iraqization. And we know from what happened in the couple of years after we left Iraq, what a disaster that was by leaving a country that's not prepared to take care of itself from a security standpoint. The Islamic State came over and took took over much of Iraq, and the same thing is really set up to happen in Vietnam. He tries to help and balance this out with increasing air support, and then looking at the VC strongholds inside of Cambodia, and has a plan to deal with that. But it really is the belief that we can leave this country in its own hands against a superior force and a superior army, and it just doesn't happen. Another thing that he tries to do is he links the communist states. The linkage policy links communist North Vietnam to China and to Russia, and he starts negotiating with them, and he persuades them to cut back their support of the guerrillas in Vietnam and of the North itself. And he does this in concessions for economic and nuclear fields, so that they can help develop their own nuclear programs and make them better. Let's look back from now at the result that happened to happen. Two major nuclear powers in the world today, world powers, and a lot of it is supported in an attempt to get us out of Vietnam. Negotiations start. Henry Kissinger goes in and starts negotiating for withdrawal and for peace in Vietnam. And then, those bases in Cambodia that were being occupied by the North and by the Viet Cong, he allows U.S. forces to go in. This is viewed as an expansion of war. We're now invading a sovereign country to get the Vietnamese fighters out of there. And it erodes the support back home as well. The popular support for the war is really crushing to the military effort right now. Major protest about the war starts to happen in college campuses around the country, and then an incident happens at Kent State where, and it's a long story, but essentially they'd protested about the military earlier, and they had set the ROTC building on fire. And then after that, they planned another protest for later. It gets out, and it's publicized. They ask them not to protest. The governor sends in National Guard troops to mitigate this. The protest happens, and without orders, somebody fires into the crowd, and nobody really knows why or how. There's no threat from the crowd, and then we end up wounding and killing some college students who are simply exercising their right to free speech and protesting against the war. Again, all of these incidents really heck, we're well along into it. It continues to erode the support for war in Vietnam. This hurts the president. It hurts the president politically, as our forces are not successful. If you recall, the Gulf of Tonkin incident resulted in the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that gave the president a blank check. Congress goes back with the War Powers Act in 1973 and takes that away. And the new law says that the president can only commit troops if there are national interests are at stake, and he can only do that for up to 60 days, and he has to give Congress consent. After 60 days, they have to be out, or Congress has to do something themselves. Generally, this is done today with just an address to the nation. That meets the consent of Congress part of it. And you still see it happening with deployments all the way around the world. But the Congress holds the money. And so if they don't fund any type of activity, it generally holds the president accountable to bring those soldiers home. Continue bombing, right? We haven't been successful bombing in Vietnam yet, so let's double down. And Nixon orders the heaviest bombing strikes since World War II, tries to get North Vietnam to a negotiation point, and he does that, but still takes quite a bit of time to do that. One of the lasting legacies of Vietnam is our prisoners of war, many who never returned. A third of the POWs died in captivity early on in the war, and then later in the war, it was about a fifth of the prisoners that went to any type of captivity died. And the way they were held in captivity was very different. If you were in North Vietnam, you were in a standard prison, and I'm going to show you some pictures of that in a little bit. And if you were in South Vietnam, you were held by North Vietnamese troops in jungle camps. The conditions were just terrible. They were kept in small cages like an animal. And they were moved around, kept walking all around the jungle. Very difficult to locate, very difficult to rescue, and very difficult to escape from. In the North, The prisoners suffered more. I mean, suffered differently. I would say suffering in a jungle camp in the South was probably traumatic and terrible. But suffering in the North by standard psychological torture and physical torture to break the resistance of the prisoners was the method of operation employed by the North Vietnamese. They tried to do this to get information about operations, but after you've been gone from your unit for just a matter of weeks, that information is no longer any good. So then they used it for propaganda to show back to the world. Say, see, these men are even, they're saying they're criminals. They would get them to write letters about being sorry for what they have done. They would parade them out in front of the press. And all the time, our prisoners are resisting to the best that they possibly could. The Ho Lau prison, or what's known as the Hanoi Hilton, was a prison that was used by the French against the Vietnamese when the French colonial empire was there. This guillotine was not used against U.S. forces there, but it was used against the Vietnamese. So it gives them an education in how to torture and how to break down the spirit of the prisoners. And this is still on display there. The Ho Lau prison is now a museum. It's downtown in Hanoi, so you can't break out. If you broke out of there, you think of an American pilot, 6 foot tall, who'd been flying airplanes, and the average height of the people in North Vietnamese were much shorter than that. He'd stand out. So nobody escaped from the Hanoi Hilton. Lots of methods of torture. Rope torture, which I'll explain in a minute. Waterboarding was pretty common. I think a lot of you have heard of waterboarding, when they place a towel over your face and tilt your head down so your feet are up and your head is down. They pour water to suffocate the towel, and it gives you this this sensation of drowning. Electrocution was another one, where they would take just DC battery cables and hook them to sponges that are wet, and they would use them to touch the body and electrocute them. Bamboo shooting, where they would take bamboo shoots and put them underneath your fingernails and toenails. Beatings. They would take you at times and put them in full barrels of water and close the barrel so that there's very little air in there. A lot of it was torture physically. A lot of it was psychological. Forced starvation, prolonged solitary confinement to try to drive people mad. More conditions inside the Hanoi Hilton. This, for instance, is where they were shackled and kept in there for days at a time until they were taken out to be beaten and interrogated. This was the prison that Senator John McCain spent several years in. Here's rope torture. So rope torture, what they do is they bind often your elbows and your arms behind your back. Here it shows the hands being bound, but often they would bind the elbows as well. And then and in Vietnam, a lot of times they would do this over a post in the ceiling. But the objective was to take the shoulder blades and rotate them forward till both shoulder blades come out of socket. They would do this by, again, they would throw them up over a board or a rafter, and they would pull them up, rotate it up by their arms, so the arms would rotate from the back out of socket and over your head, and they would suspend your weight by those shoulders that had been ripped out of socket. And eventually this goes numb, right? I mean, it hurts for a period of time, very painful, and then it goes numb. And they didn't want that. So what they would do after that is they would rotate them back through, causing the same amount of pain to put the shoulders back into socket so they could continue the process. Just incredibly, incredibly torturous what they would do there. The turning point for this was when Ho Chi Minh dies in 1969. When this happens, the conditions of our prisoners do improve, and we start to negotiate the prisoner exchanges there. But ultimately, 771 captured, 113 died in captivity in the Hanoi Hilton. This video that I'm going to show is of an airman who was shot down in Vietnam and was kept in captivity. And he explains the way that they communicated by a developed tap code. And that's not Morse code, it's a tap code. And I'll let him explain it here.
There was a bridge that the North Vietnamese had built, and it was an essential part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, so it was a very important target. As I released the bombs, some lucky gunner got an exploding anti-aircraft round that hit my engine, and I knew I had to eject, and I did so. Part of our training in fighters was to go through a survival training program. And while I was there, I was in a class, and a master sergeant happened to be the instructor, and he was explaining how in World War II, prisoners held by the Germans were able to communicate between two buildings by tapping on a water pipe. And as I was walking out of the class, the instructor was just beside me, and I said, "How did they send the dashes?" And he said, "Oh, I should explain. It was not the Morse code. It was a tap code. They were not teaching it as part of the program, but I just happened by chance to learn it from this instructor." So after I was shot down in North Vietnam, I was one of the very early shoot downs, and I was able to communicate that tap code to some other POWs. As we were moved from into other camps away from Hanoi, always someone took the tap code with them and was able to pass it on. So no matter where you went in the POW system in North Vietnam, if you heard this, the guy on the other side of the wall would, and you were started the communication process. I guess the reason we all knew it was so important is it was a morale factor, of course, just to be able to communicate. We helped each other when someone was taken out and badly mistreated for days or whatever, and finally came back to his cell. He would be physically, mentally, emotionally almost a basket case. After his door was closed and the turnkey left, and the first thing he would hear is, that's GBU. And he would, take strength from that, knowing that we understood.
Bud had just been admitted that day to hospice, and Dory and I went in the other room to talk so that Smitty and Bud could have a time together. And in a few minutes, Smitty came out of the room and his eyes had welled up, and he was not actively crying, but I could tell it was right there, just ready to happen. And as we got in the car, Smitty said, the tears came down. He said, "You know what just happened?" And I said, "What?" And he said, "When I started to leave Bud, he reached up and grabbed my hand, and on the back of my hand, he tapped GDU." And both of us kind of lost it at that point, because that code meant so much to them, and it still does.
So oftentimes they weren't allowed to even speak, right? So the only communication that these guys had with each other was the tap code, and the tap code became increasingly important in to the POWs that were kept primarily in North Vietnam. So this sets the stage for the withdrawal, right? 66% of the Americans favored pulling all troops out of Vietnam. Almost complete loss of support for any type of war effort there. Negotiated peace happens in 1973. We agreed to a ceasefire. North Vietnam, they keep their troops in the South. That's the agreement. We're going to withdraw, and we would like our POWs back. So we did get a number of POWs back, although we know that a lot of them, particularly those in jungle camps, are still considered missing in action. that peace doesn't last, or the ceasefire doesn't last very long. Again, Vietnamization doesn't work, right? You can't support an army and a nation up to a point, and then for your own reasons pull out and say that we've given you everything. This peace agreement, fails. Short time after that, North Vietnamese army launches a full-scale invasion and takes over the South. Nixon promised to come in and help if that happened, but Nixon had to step down in view of the Watergate scandal. So there was no help coming in to support South Vietnam. The capital of Saigon fell, and they renamed it Ho Chi Minh City, which it's still renamed today. There's some facts about Vietnam. And I think Vietnam the Vietnam War and their veterans have a negative, we have a negative belief about what those men and women contributed to. So just look at this for a second. Nearly double the amount of casualties after we left than while we were there. The movement for peace killed more people in that area of the world than our war against the North. 91% of the veterans say they're glad that they served. 74% say they would still serve and do it all again. Most people today hold them in high esteem, although what they experienced when they came back was what shouldn't happen to anybody. I mean, they were spit on, called baby killers. It's just that whole anti-war movement took their aggression out on individuals instead of policy, which I think is why things are so different today when you see troops returning home from Afghanistan, which is becoming an unpopular war. Troops returning home from Iraq, even as late as 2014, had become an unpopular war. The election with President Obama had really, really been going on bringing those people home. They were never treated that way. They were never called baby killers. People still line up at airports to greet soldiers and airmen when they come home. So I think maybe we learned a lesson from this, and in that it's not the person's fault that there's bad policy. And then, again, I've said this multiple times as we went through Vietnam. This is the theme, right? The U.S. did not lose a single battle during its involvement, including the Tet Offensive, which was a huge psychological victory for the North because it defeated us. This is General Zapp's legacy, right? Again, the greatest military commander in the aftermath of World War II, initially supported by the United States against the Japanese. History teacher at one point in his life, defeats the French, defeats the Americans, and wins over what becomes his country as a communist country.